All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started with the Select Committee on Renewable Energy Development and the Restoration of the Salton Sea. Welcome, everyone, to the Capitol, and we're here in room 447. We will have members coming in and out of the hearing. And just for the purpose of introductions, I'll start with the far right and have the two members that are present introduce themselves in the area that they represent. All right, it's a small area. There we go. How about I think I had you guys on mute. Just one more time.
Anthony Rendon. I still represent Southeast Los Angeles County.
That's good.
Should I do it all over again? Let's see if I can. We'll do it the other way. Yucaipa, Calamasa, Banning, Beaumont, Hemet, San Jacinto, Palm Springs, Palm Desert, Rancho Mirage, Indian Wells, La Quinta, Yucca Valley, Tornine Palms.
It's like a whole new district.
Yeah.
That's right. I'll go down the list real quick. Catherine Baker, Assemblywoman who also sits on the committee, is familiar with the Salton Sea area. Assemblymember Bill Dodd, who also represents an area with the geothermal opportunities. Assemblywoman Cristina Garcia, representing the Los Angeles area. Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez represents the San Diego border. Brian Jones, who also has his assembly district adjacent to the Imperial County boundaries. Mr. Mays has introduced himself. Mr. Rendon, who also chairs the Utilities Committee, and Assemblymember Dos Williams. As I mentioned, many of them will be coming in and out, and we're going to jump right in. I want to thank you for being here. As the name of the committee conveys, the purpose of today's hearing is to look into issues impacting the Seas region and the ability to develop and deploy its own renewable energy resources. Specifically, as it's been brought to our attention, geothermal and other renewable energy resources that are available in and around the Salton Sea area. Without getting into a long introduction, I'm going to just jump right in to the agenda. We have a number of speakers. Their bios are in the packet that you picked up at the entrance to this hearing room. And we'll get right in with our first presenter, which will be the topic, California's electrical grid and overview. And we'll ask Mr. Neil Miller to please come forward and jump right into his presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, I prepared a brief presentation today, I provided a brief presentation today that gives an overview of some of the issues in the state of the California electricity grid. I'll walk through that and would be very pleased to answer any questions you may have. So, if you will, I'll just dive right in. So, the comments today I'm making, the issues we're looking at affect the California system more broadly, but the details that I have available relate primarily to the California ISO transmission grid and system grid. The ISO's footprint represents over 80% of the California system and serves over 30 million Californians. And it's part of the much broader Western interconnection that's made up of 14 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and part of Mexico. So when we're looking at many of the issues, the interrelationship with other regions within the Western interconnect often have to be taken into account. There are 38 separate balancing authorities within the Western interconnection, and each is responsible for managing the supply and demand within each of those areas. Now, for California, I'm leading the charge and moving the transition to renewable generation. That's moving very well towards the 33% RPS goals for 2020. The resources are largely under contract. As I've noted in the material, that the the ISO utilities served about 27% of their load last year from renewable generation sources. And the renewable generation connected directly to our system, the output from those sources climbed by over 20% from the preceding year. And we're expecting to see that continue to ratchet up as we move to the 33% levels. Now, this is one slide where the graph really is important. This is what's become known as the duck curve of the daily supply curve for load shapes within California. And it demonstrates the issues that we need to manage to really properly and reliably manage the transition to higher levels of renewable generation. This is a daily load curve taken, the baseline was taken from March in 2012, and then higher levels of solar generation as we move towards 2020 were imposed to show what the net load shape would look like. And the important issues that really show up on this graph, one is the potential for overgeneration in the middle of the afternoon. And that really shows at on this graph in the 2 to 3 in the afternoon time slot. The other issue that needs to be managed on the grid is the high ramping rates, where as the solar is dropping off, load is either still staying at the same levels or even continuing to climb. We get cases where the rest of the generation fleet need to ramp up very quickly to accommodate the continuing load even after the solar pattern starts to drop off for that day. Now, this has become a very important issue as well for us. The ISO strategic plan really focuses, for the organization, focuses on 3 main issues. One is to reliably manage the transition. The second is to lead the way in the transition to the higher renewable generation. And the third, recognizing the importance, afternoon, thank you. The third issue is to really manage and achieve the benefits of the broader regional diversity of both supply and demand across the broader Western footprint. These are the different strategies we see necessary to make the transition and to ensure that service is reliable. Now, in terms of looking at the transmission grid a little closer to home, we also have to manage within California the transmission planning very effectively with our neighbors. Of those 38 balancing authority areas, there are 8 that operate in whole or in part inside California. Each have their own rules and processes for connecting new resources and getting supply to market. We conduct our transmission planning through an annual process that is part of a FERC-approved tariff process, and that work is heavily coordinated with both the California Public Utilities Commission, especially in the area of forecasting where generation will be located, as well as with the California Energy Commission, focusing on the load forecast and preferred resources such as energy efficiency or load-modifying demand response programs. The last thing I wanted to touch on was just to provide the perspective of where we're at today with transmission access into the Imperial area. There had been some complications arising out of the early shuttering of the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, but through the activities in previous cycles and in particular in our 2014-2015 transmission plan, we have identified the mechanisms that together with previously approved transmission projects basically restore deliverability out of that area overall to the levels that had been established or forecast previously. Now, what that means is that after taking into account the generation projects that are already moving forward in the area, whether they connect to the ISO directly or whether they connect to the IID system, we still forecast about 500 to 750 megawatts of additional capacity available for new generation that's not under contract at this time. We had also studied, to help support this initiative, we had also studied higher levels of generation and saw that to go beyond that level could require some very expensive upgrades in the range of $1 to $2 billion to bring it to go beyond those levels and achieve even higher levels of renewable generation. So, those are the key points I wanted to make, and I want to thank you for the time to provide that overview, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions I could help with.
Thank you. Just wanted to recognize before we get to questions, Senator Wessel joining us, as well as Assemblymember Bill Dodd. So open it up for questions. Gentlemen, questions, comments?
Nope.
All right. Let me ask you just a question regarding the curtailing of in-state renewables. Can you give us an overview or explanation why we are curtailing in-state renewables while we are at the same time importing out-of-state fossil resources? Okay.
Well, within the California, within the ISO footprint, and this is where I wouldn't be able to comment about municipal load that are outside of the ISO footprint, we wouldn't be expecting to see that happen. We would expect imports to be curtailed first through the economic operation of our market, and the curtailment of the in-state resources in the overgen situation, where these resources want to stay online but need to be curtailed because of oversupply, that would only occur after. But that's really governed through the functioning of the electricity market itself based on the price determination.
Okay. Questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We'll jump right into the next segment of the hearing, renewables, large-scale storage. And we have the first speaker is Jim Caldwell. He's the project manager for 2030 low-carbon grid study. Welcome.
See, is this the? What do I do here? There. Okay. My name is Jim Caldwell, and I'm the project manager for the low-carbon grid study. We've been studying for about 18 months now, looking at the grid in California in 2030 with roughly half of the greenhouse gas emissions from 2012. That's the space that we're looking at with the low-carbon grid study. We've just finished what we call our Phase 2 modeling. The peer-reviewed written report will be out roughly sometime in August, but the results are out now and we'll be starting to talk about it. This hearing is actually the first place where we've presented any of the Phase 2 results. And so I'd like to share with you just at least one of those, and that's the chart that's a little bit complicated, but this is sort of our version or another way of looking at the duct chart. This representation is called a duration curve, and on the x-axis or the horizontal axis you have 8,760 hours in the year, and then on the vertical axis in this case you have curtailment of renewables in megawatts. And there's two cases drawn. The first case A, both of these cases, by the way, are a 55% renewables world. Just for reference, case A, most of the procurement from here on out is dominated by solar PV. In case B, we have what we call their balanced portfolio, where we are procuring not only solar PV but also some out-of-state wind. Geothermal from the Salton Sea is included heavily in portfolio B. A little bit of concentrating solar power. But basically a variety of resources as opposed to relying almost specifically on solar PV. In case A, that's again a pretty good representation of what Neil showed in his last slide about the duct chart, and the curtailment is the result of that over-generation at noon and then the high ramps in the afternoon. And the difference between the red and the blue lines is a matter of choice. It's a matter of us choosing to mitigate the impacts of what the portfolios are and taking proactive steps to deal with that issue. So the red line is not a given. It is subject again to policies and to actions that we take between now and then to integrate the extra renewables. And these two cases bookend what we studied and bookend what we can do with what we have. In other words, nothing new in terms of technology, nothing new in terms of any new business model or anything else. It's basically just doing the best we can with what we have. And the message that I want to leave with you is that we have the technology, we have the capability to get to the levels of renewables that we're talking about here, to integrate a variety of renewables, including Imperial Valley geothermal and including other kinds of renewables, and to do that cost effectively and reliably. So it is our choice on how we do it. The two cases that are represented there, we've shown the differences. And case A is actually, again, with the solar PV dominating the procurement and no new bulk storage, is cheaper from a capital cost. So the number that we've shown there, $373 million a year, is the mortgage payment on that investment. That's how much we have to spend every year to pay down the mortgage for what we have. And so it is cheaper. Our mortgage for case A is cheaper by $373 million a year. However, the operating cost in going from case A to case B, the operating cost for case B is $865 million cheaper per year. So obviously, slightly more expensive mortgage, and you save a lot more money. Most of that savings comes from reduced natural gas consumption between the two cases. And the carbon that we save going from case A to case B is over 8 million tons a year. So we have a lot of very inexpensive, very easily attainable carbon reductions with the right policies to integrate a diverse portfolio. The reliability of both of those cases has been tested, and both cases meet all the NERC standards and have essentially equivalent reliability. Let's spend just the last couple of minutes here of what I have to say on what I mean by first the balance of portfolio, the bulk storage, and then economically rational imports and exports. The balanced portfolio, as I say, in case A, it dominated by photovoltaics. In case B, what we're saying is that there are other renewables out there besides photovoltaics that may be slightly more expensive from a fixed cost standpoint, but are easier to integrate into the system at these levels of penetration. So by having a balanced portfolio, much like your stock portfolio needs to be balanced, having a balanced portfolio helps. We also, in order to handle economically some of that curtailment, we need to add some bulk storage. We added roughly about half again as much bulk storage as we have today on the system in case B, and that then gives the operators, gives Neil's guys more flexibility to deal with the issues that are associated with the intermittence and the variability of the renewables. The third case, the economically rational imports and exports, that's code words for saying trade with our neighbors. And I think Neil talked about that. We can talk about that. That is a subject that could go on and on and on, and there are a lot of little implications for that. But what it really says is that we cannot act as an island, that we need to deal with our neighbors, and that is a win-win for both of us. And if we do that, then we will both win, and we will get down the road. The fourth one, renewables allowed to provide essential reliability services and flexibility. That again is a code word for saying that as we go to this new grid, which has more and more renewables, that all of the ancillary characteristics of the resources that are required for reliability, that if we depend upon the rest of the system, the shrinking shrinking percentage of fossil resources to supply those, then it gets more and more expensive. And those fossil resources must then be kept online to provide those services, and being kept online in those low load hours in the middle of the day in the hot solar days, then that crowds out the renewables, and that leads to curtailment. There is no question that physically these new renewables are capable of supplying those resources, but they're different. There's no question that we need to work on interconnection standards. We need to work on codes. We need to work on tariff changes at the ISO. We need to work on Rule 21 at the PUC. We need to work on issues at the CEC and in the siting process at the CEC. It's a whole list of things that we need to do to recognize the fact that these new resources can and will and must, if we are to expect to cost effectively and reliably integrate them, help supply these essential reliability services. I guess I would say, I'll put in a plug for Assemblyman Garcia's AB 197. That bill begins to open that conversation about using these resources to supply these essential reliability services. It's not the final answer, but it does open the conversation. And the sooner we work on these issues, the sooner we get to working on those 4 issues of the balanced portfolio, the additional bulk storage, working on economically rational imports and exports, and getting to the essential reliability services from renewables, the better off we will be and the easier and cheaper it will be to get to where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the plug. We will be before the Senator Wessel's committee pretty soon, so thank you for the letter of recommendation. Questions, members?
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question, I think, in the last couple of minutes you started to answer it, but when we talk about the Case B, the sort of more diverse portfolio, wondering, in your opinion, what needs to happen in this building in order to help us realize that. You talked about AB 197 and Rule 21 and some modifications that have to happen at the CEC, but can you expand on that a little bit? What can we do, particularly in the legislature, in order to help realize Case B?
Well, I think, again, the most important thing is that we need to understand that this is a portfolio, that it is not, that at these levels of penetration, it is not saying this particular resource has these characteristics, the rest of the system stays the same, and we're just going to plug it into a static system. That when you get to be 50% of the annual energy, you are the dominant resource on the system, and you must think of the system differently, and you must think of it as a whole. And it's more a matter of attitude. It's more a matter of flexibility between the ears than it is flexibility on the grid. There's enough inherent flexibility in the physics and in the capability, but it is so different, and it is not something that people are used to doing. And so, to me, the most important thing is to start, is to recognize that this is the direction we are headed. These are the resources that we need to rely on in the future, and we need to begin to practice. We need to begin to practice with small steps. We need to increase the confidence that the people on the floor at the ISO have in the ability of these resources to respond, and we need to keep pushing that. And it's going to be a long, involved process, but it really is about the flexibility between our ears. It's not the flexibility on the grid.
All right, thank you. Any follow-up? Member Dodd?
Yeah, I apologize. I got in here late, so I'm kind of got about half of the last one and all of yours. I guess my question is all this relative to the geothermal possibilities down there, or does this case exist throughout the grid in the state of California? Is there anything unique about this to where we're, our subcommittee?
I think the Imperial Valley geothermal is a good example. I view it as one of those places. Case B has, as I remember, roughly 1,500 megawatts of new geothermal from the Imperial Valley in it, whereas Case A has none. Okay, so it's a good example of, if you think about, we use the words least cost, best fit. But when we actually put those words into practice, we begin to forget everything except least first cost. And what we need to do is we need to think about all of the characteristics of these grids and how they all fit together. And when we do that, and a good example being Imperial Valley geothermal, we can get to a less expensive, more reliable system than if we just think about them as a one-off. There is enough The geothermal resources in the Salton Sea can supply flexibility. They can supply things with names like governor response and frequency response and transient stability and all those electrical engineering terms. But we have to ask them to do that. We have to have the codes written so that they can supply. And those provision of those services costs something, and we have to compensate the owners for providing those services. And so it's just a matter of saying that this is where we're headed, and this is how we can do it, and I think Imperial Valley Geothermal is a good example. We did not set off with this study to view strictly Imperial Valley Geothermal or to call it out, but it is a good example of how we can do it.
Just follow up. So you're saying that this dynamic is probably the case for everywhere within the grid, that we ought to be looking at a more diverse portfolio.
Yes, definitely.
And then to follow up with my colleague, Assemblymember Rendon, I mean, obviously the numbers here really appear to be a no-brainer. I mean, so much so, why has this been missed? In your
number one, I have to say, maybe this is the first time, at least it's the first study that I've seen that's tried to quantify these numbers, but I do want to put a word of caution in here. That is not to say that those numbers there are all four of those bullets, so that just procuring a balanced portfolio won't get you that whole thing. It's all four of those combined. And they're not necessarily additive. How much you assign to each one of those things depends upon what order in which you do it. Because when you have a system like the red line that's really constrained, and basically you've put a straitjacket around the system and you've not allowed a lot of flexibility to happen, the first thing you do to loosen those bounds, to take the straitjacket off, always looks great. The last one, the one that you do right before the blue line, you've already gotten 80-90% of the good, and there's not that much left to benefit. So you need to be careful about adding things up. And I don't want to leave the impression that the only thing you need to do is to procure a balanced portfolio. I just think that balanced portfolio is an important ingredient in looking for this as a whole going forward. And so you need to do some of all of those, and the sooner we start, the better off we're going to be.
Yes, sir.
So what is the opportunity cost of, when you curtail that red line going up? What is the opportunity? Assuming that energy is already produced, what happens to that?
Well, you just throw it away. I mean, you're just saying, what you're really saying with that red line is that I'm going to buy basically natural gas resources at, let's say, something on the order of $40 a megawatt hour, and I'm going to go out and purchase that at $40 at the same time that I'm going to be throwing away the resources that I've already paid for and have a new marginal cost of zero. So it's costing me roughly $40 a megawatt hour every time I curtail. Now, if I have to curtail in order to maintain the reliability of the system, then that $40 is actually pretty cheap. We can't have 2,500 hours out of the year when the lights go off. That's just not, we can't have 1 hour out of the year where at this level, at this bulk level, we run the lights off. So we have to be prepared to curtail. That's why there is a little tail even with that blue line. There are a few hours where that becomes the least cost thing to do, is to curtail, and that will always be the case. But we can afford to spend the money and to procure resources that require less curtailment, to procure some bulk storage, to trade rationally with our neighbors, and to develop the mechanisms and the institutions to allow those trades to happen more cost effectively, and again to, if you will, pass, implement, and expand on AB 197. Those are kind of like the four things in the line.